Chapter 9 of The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby by Ellen Thornycroft Fowler. Chapter 9 Gabriel the Priest. Whitsunday dawned fair and bright, and the Vernacre party duly to church repaired at the appointed hour. Lord Wrexham was a man who regularly attended divine worship every Sunday morning, and there was a general impression abroad at Vernacre, though he never expressed it in words, that he expected his guests to do likewise. Vernacre Church was a rare and perfect specimen of Norman architecture, and as Isabel Seton sat in the beautiful and ancient edifice, and watched the sunlight pouring through the old stained windows upon the brows of the stone crusaders lying asleep upon their tombs, the atmosphere of the prayers of countless generations stole into her soul, and filled it with a great peace. For long centuries the incense of prayer had risen up to heaven from this little western temple, and now she too was adding her humble petitions to the unbroken chain of ceaseless supplication. She too was saying her amens to the age-long intercessions of departed saints. For a time the overpowering influence of an historic church seized her and held her in its grasp. The hymn of praise which she was now singing had been begun in Jerusalem on this very day nearly 19 centuries ago, and it would sound on down the ages yet to come, until it was at last merged in that new song thundering upon Mount Zion, which no man could learn save those which were redeemed from the earth and had the Father's name written in their foreheads. There had been no break in the continuity of that song, no pause in the uplifting of those prayers, no extinguishing of that sacred fire which was first kindled by the 11 tongues when the apostles were all with one accord in one place. Now, alas, the disciples of the Master are no longer in one place with one accord. The primitive state of unity has long gone by. There have been strifes and persecutions where there should have been love and peace. Yet the chain of prayer and praise remains unbroken and intact, although even devout men are apt to forget that though there is but one church, there are divers forms of utterance in that church, and that it is still given to each of us to hear, every man in his own tongue wherein he was born, the wonderful works of God. When the sermon began, Isabel attuned herself to listen, for she was ever athirst, like the Athenians of old, to hear some new thing, but it turned out to be one of those discourses which George Herbert had in his mind's eye when he said, God takes a text and preacheth patience. So Isabel's thoughts were driven back upon herself, and her patient meditations took a personal turn. She thought of herself and Paul, and of how their future life was going to shape itself. She dwelt with regret, half tender and half humorous, upon her husband's wonderful power of seeing only one side of a question, and that always the brighter side. She did not as yet understand that it is the men that see only one side of a question who have most power in convincing other men, that it is the enthusiast rather than the wiseacre who removes mountains and wins battles. The wise men have their place in the world could not roll on comfortably without them, but we do not place them in the forefront of the battle, nor entrust them with the leadership of forlorn hopes. It is the old heads that watch and guard and counsel and advise, but it is the young shoulders that push and jostle and make their way through the crowd. Isabel loved her husband with all her heart and reverenced him with all her soul, but she had not yet passed the final and most difficult test of wifely submission, namely the conviction that he knew better than she did, a conviction which, if not always supported by facts, must invariably count for righteousness to the woman who is imbued with it. To Isabel's easy, good-humoured cynicism, Paul's almost boyish adherence to his ideals appeared visionary and unpractical. It seemed like believing in fairies and witches and gnomes. The difference between their two natures, while it intensified their love, made it difficult for them to understand each other, and yet each character had its compensations. Paul believed in the ideal side of human nature more than Isabel did. His world was more densely peopled with heroes and saints than was hers. Yet, on the other hand, his very belief in humanity made him hard upon it when it failed and fell short, whilst she cherished an abundant tolerance towards all the faults and weaknesses of her fellows. The denizens of Isabel's world were not heroes nor saints, but ordinary men and women. Therefore she was neither angry nor disappointed when they comported themselves according to their kind. But Paul, it must be admitted, was sometimes both. After indulging in sundry half-humorous, half-pathetic regrets over Paul's singleness of eye and blindness of heart, as she considered them, Isabel's thoughts flew to the possible governorship of Tasmania as the one safe refuge from the dangers and follies which assailed her husband. There he would be safe for a while, and would have time to learn that wisdom which only time can teach, and it would not only be a safe city of refuge, it would be a glorious palace of delights. Isabel had been very happy out in India long ago with Sir Benjamin and Lady Farley, and she had ever since looked upon the life of a colonial governor as the most perfect form of earthly existence possible, bar one. The one thing more utterly delightful than the life of a colonial governor being the life of a colonial governor's wife. To feel that such a lot was practically within her grasp made her almost dizzy with happiness. It would be the realization of her most cherished castles in the air, the fulfilment of her wildest dreams. She could imagine nothing else on earth that she should enjoy so much as thus playing at being a queen. It would suit her artistic nature and her dramatic instincts down to the ground, she thought, and she revelled in the contemplation of the mere possibility of it. And Isabel was not the only one who saw visions in the old village church on that summer Sunday morning. Fabia also dreamed dreams. She was sitting near to the tomb of one of the ancient lords of Vernacre, who wore upon his helmet the head of a Saracen maid. And Fabia recalled the story of this old crusader, which his descendant had related to her on the preceding evening. Sir Godfrey de Wrexham had been taken prisoner by the Saracens soon after he joined the first crusade, and the daughter of his captor, a Saracen maid of great beauty, saw the English knight and fell in love with him. Secretly she visited him in his dungeon and offered to effect his escape on condition that he would take her with him back to England as his wife. The temptation was great, but Sir Godfrey was a man of honour, and he therefore confessed to the lady that he was already betrothed to one of his own countrywomen, and was bound, should he ever return to England, to marry that lady, so that escape upon the terms now offered was impossible. But the Moorish girl boasted that most precious of all possessions, an absolutely unselfish love, and she still effected the escape of the knight and sent him back to England to marry his lady love, which he accordingly did, and lived happy ever after. But he henceforth wore as his crest the head of a Saracen maid in token of his gratitude. And as Fabia Vipart looked at the crest upon his helmet, a great pity for the woman filled her heart. So this girl had had to learn, as she herself had done, how cold were the English, and how wrapped up in themselves and in each other. She wondered what happened to the Moorish maiden after the knight had fled. Did she die of a broken heart because she had loved in vain? Or did her father slay her because she had contrived the escape of his enemy, and had allowed a Christian to gaze upon the beauty of her face? Upon this point history was silent. It only busied itself with the domestic affairs of the Englishman, in chronicling the ancestry of his highly respectable wife, and the number of his commonplace children. So handsome, however, was his marble effigy, that Fabia did not blame the maid for having loved him, and beautiful indeed was the female head upon his crest, beautiful, somewhat after Fabia's own fashion. But there was no beauty in the face or figure of the woman lying by his side, mentioned in the fading inscription on the tomb as Dame Philippa his wife. Hers was a stiff, prim kind of face, made still stiffer and primmer by the severe and hideous dress of her time. And he had given up the Moorish girl for a woman such as this. How truly English of him, said Fabia to herself with a little scornful smile. Fabia wondered who this lady had been before her marriage. Perhaps one of the Latimers of Lusk, or one of the bearers of some equally respectable old name which the English love to conjure with. For apparently to the typical British mind the glory of a long line of noble Oriental ancestry was as nothing compared with the overpowering honour of being born a Latimer of Lusk, or its equivalent. Then a change came o'er the spirit of Fabia's dream, and she began to envy this Eastern maiden instead of pitying her, envying her because it had been given to her to love another so much that her own happiness became as nothing. After all, there was something in this love which transfigured life and glorified death as nothing else could do. And Fabia had never tasted it, never known for an instant what it was to love another better than herself. She wondered if this had been her own fault or the fault of her circumstances. She was too clear-sighted not to blame herself when blame was due, but she was not sure in this case whether she deserved it. She knew that she would gladly have loved if she could, thankfully have merged her own life and happiness in the life and happiness of another, but the power to do so seemed to have been denied her. She could always look critically upon her friends, whoever they might be, always see clearly the faults of those about her, yet while she plumed herself upon her own open vision and despised the blind credulity of other people, she could not help envying simpler women their unshaken and unshakable conviction that their own particular husbands were infallible and omniscient, and that the judgment of those gifted beings on any and every subject under or even above the sun was absolute and final. Such perfect confidence in the other partner to the transaction would certainly very much simplify the difficulties of married life, but where was Fabia to find the man who could inspire her with such confidence? In vain she ran down the list of possible husbands. Captain Gaythorne was out of the question. He was such a consummate fool. Lord Wrexham had rank and dignity, but he lacked the magnetism of personal charm, which to Fabia was indispensable. Her cousin Mukharji dominated her intellectually, but he was wanting in that social prestige which in her eyes counted for so much. Gabriel Carr possessed physical beauty as well as mental power, but although she admired him more than any man she had yet seen, she felt that there was an almost feminine quickness of perception and subtlety of thought about him which would always prevent her from acknowledging him as the superior power and cause her to regard him as an equal. In the depths of her heart she knew that she longed to find her master. She felt her very soul was crying out for the touch of a conquering hand, and she knew further that if ever she did find such a one, a man who would rule her absolutely with a rod of iron, and would prove himself once and for all stronger than herself, she could come to his call, whoever and what whatever he was, and would submissively acknowledge in the face of all the world the divine right of such a thing. There are two types of women in this world: the woman who is seeking for her master, and the woman who is seeking for her mate. They are equally normal, equally feminine. There is no credit in being of the one sort, no discredit in belonging to the other. Yet it behooves every woman to find out to which classification she does belong, and to marry accordingly, lest haply she should discover too late that she has chosen a prince to take the part of a playfellow, or a comrade to wear the crown of a king. For the last few weeks the friendship between Fabia and the vicar of St. Etheldreda's had been growing apace. Carr had seized every available opportunity that he could snatch from his busy life to see Miss Vipart, and Fabia had made such opportunities as easy and as frequent as she could. But the two regarded their friendship for each other from entirely opposite points of view. To Fabia, Gabriel was merely a man who attracted her, and whom, womanlike, she meant to subjugate. To Gabriel, Fabia was the only woman in the world. His life had been so busy and his mind so absorbed in his work that he had hitherto given but little attention to women and their ways. He had dealt with their souls to the best of his ability, but had not concerned himself much about their hearts. He was intent upon preparing them wholesale for a home in heaven, but it had never yet occurred to him to offer one of them a home on earth. But when Fabia Vipart came and sang to him, then suddenly the face of the whole world was changed. Nothing was as it had been before. For him there were new heavens and a new earth. Fresh flowers bloomed around his feet. Unknown stars disclosed themselves to his view. She seemed to touch his whole life as with a fairy wand, and to turn the dreariest pathways into streets of gold. They had talked much to each other, and upon many things. That is to say, Gabriel had talked and Fabia had listened, putting in the necessary word here and there to show that she understood. And in thus talking, Carr had revealed his inmost soul to Fabia, and at the same time to himself. For it is in talking to other people about ourselves that we, rather than they, learn what manner of men and women we are. He believed that Fabia had shown him what she really was, and he was accordingly grateful to her. He did not know that he had shown himself what he really was by endeavouring to show the same to her. Know thyself is advice worthy of being followed, but we rarely get to know ourselves except by making ourselves known to others. Which accounts for the fact that the most reserved people are as a rule the people who are the least cognizant of their own failings and excellencies. And Carr had also learnt a great deal about Fabia as well as about himself. He understood far better than she did that her faults were the outcome of circumstances rather than of character. He knew that she only wanted that master hand for which at present she was vaguely groping, to develop her into as fine a woman inwardly as she now was outwardly, to make her heart and soul as admirable as her mind and body. He recognized the passionate, fiery, loving nature at present hidden underneath the cold and bitter and sarcastic exterior, and he knew that it only needed the kiss of the fairy prince to awaken the real sleeping beauty to life and love. But there was one thing about her which he did not understand, and that was the absence of any religious element in her nature. The naturally unreligious woman is very rare, but she nevertheless exists. In most women the religious instinct is strongly developed, and it is a good thing for the world in general that this should be so. But there is a minority who are practically without this instinct altogether, and this minority have to be reckoned with, and their deficiency supplied. The unreligious woman need not necessarily develop into an irreligious one. In fact, she not infrequently proves herself precisely the contrary. But religion must come to her through the channels of her other attributes, as she has no natural aptitude for it, and these channels are usually found in her love for some good man or woman who becomes to her a messenger of the gospel of peace. Milton's Eve was a woman of this kind, or he could never have written the line, "He for God only, she for God in him." The naturally religious woman loves her husband because she loves God. The naturally unreligious woman loves God because she loves her husband. The modes may be different, but the final results are the same. But it is difficult for any man to realize that there may be a woman without this instinct altogether, and Gabriel made this mistake in his estimate of Fabia's character. He had discovered upon further acquaintance that she was not as absolutely perfect as he had believed her to be when first he heard her sing, and he had also discovered that she was a far finer character than other people, than even she herself gave her credit for being, but he failed to understand the simple paganism of her nature. He had no idea how utterly she was lacking in the religious element. For some time he was torn asunder between his love for her and his devotion to his work. Then gradually he came to believe that the two passions were not, as he had at first assumed, opposed to each other, that a wife would help rather than hinder him in following his sacred calling. How Fabia's great gifts, rightly dedicated, would aid in the great work of saving men's souls and bringing them to God, he thought. How the influence of her face and her voice would brighten the lives of many committed to his charge, and how the comfort and happiness of her love and companionship would refresh and strengthen him for the fulfillment of the most strenuous and arduous duties that he could ever be called upon to undertake. As this idea took possession of him, Gabriel's heart was filled with a great joy, and he made up his mind to ask Fabia to be his wife as soon as he thought she had known himself and his sphere of labour long enough to be able to make a wise decision. He was fully aware that the lot he was about to offer to her was no bed of roses, but he was also aware that it was not in the vapid amusements of a life of pleasure and gaiety to satisfy the cravings of such a soul as hers. He had learnt that she was not as perfect as he had at first believed her to be, but he had also learnt that there were possibilities of perfection in her, as indeed there are in everybody, although some of us are quick to hide them in ourselves and slow to discover them in others. Nevertheless, in every man and every woman there is the germ of perfection, which some day, though neither here nor now, shall develop into absolute fulfilment. For God made man in his own image, and if man could ever finally destroy the image in which he was made, then would he prove himself greater than his Maker. It was an intense joy to Gabriel to find that Fabia and he would spend Whitsuntide at Vernacre together. But keen as that temptation was, he would not have accepted Lord Wrexham's invitation to leave his church and perish at one of the great festivals of the Christian year, had not his doctor told him that he had been working too hard of late, and must make up his mind either to take a short holiday or to have a long, perhaps a permanent one, forced upon him later on. So Carr chose the lesser evil and went away from London. When first he left town, he went for a week or two to Gaythorne Manor. Then he came for Whitsuntide to Vernacre, and after that he was going to stay with his mother for a month or two to complete, as he hoped, his cure. But the fact that he was overdone and out of health made him turn to Fabia, and to all that she represented, with increased eagerness. He had never before realized how much he missed the feminine element in his life and lot. Until now he had believed his work all sufficing. In health Gabriel the priest had ever been stronger than Gabriel the man. But who shall blame him if in sickness the more human part of his nature came to the front, the longing for love and tenderness and domestic bliss? On that Sunday afternoon he and Fabia were sitting together in a secluded part of the garden, and he was very happy. In his need for human care and sympathy, he gave Fabia credit for qualities which she did not possess. In the nature of most women, pity is very closely akin to love. The moment they begin to feel sorry for a man, to realize that it is in their power to help and comfort him, it is all up with them. Their hearts have already passed out of their own keeping. Perhaps they never love a man so much as when he has taken some remedy which they have prescribed, and is all the better for it. A husband who swallows his wife's remedies and recovers in consequence, or in spite of them, is the kind of husband who is most dearly beloved. But with the woman whose soul cries out for a master rather than for a mate, this is not so. It is strength that appeals most forcibly to her, not weakness, and the less strong is a man, either physically or mentally, the less powerful is his appeal to her heart and sympathies. She would be his devotee rather than his doctor, his worshipper rather than his nurse. "Miss Vipart," Gabriel began, "I have something to say to you, something which is of vital importance to me, and which I have been wanting to say for a long time." "Then why have you been a long time in saying it?" The question certainly was pertinent. "Because, though I wanted to say it, I was not at all sure that you wanted to hear it." "Ah!" Fabia's expressed answer was monosyllabic, but her understood one was quite the reverse. There was a complete string of notes of interrogation in her beautiful eyes at that moment. She possessed to perfection the charm of looking interested when a man was talking to her, and perhaps that is the greatest charm that any woman can have. It is the women who can listen that are the attractive women, at any rate to the opposite sex. They can talk as well, if they like, just enough, at any rate, gracefully to fill up the interstices in the conversation while the man is preparing his next remark. But above all things, they must be adepts in the art of listening, if they wish to belong to that fascinating sisterhood who are colloquially described as men's women. After all, if we are to be perfectly candid with ourselves, which of us goes into society to listen to what other people have to say, except in so far as it suggests to us what to say next? Who wants to hear about the funny sayings of some other man's child, except as a prologue to the recital of the far apter and wittier remarks uttered by our own more interesting and intelligent offspring? We go into society not to listen but to talk, though we are prepared to play the game and to listen, or at any rate to keep silence while the other person is having his turn, provided always that his turn does not last too long. But there are some people who allow it always to be our turn, and how popular, how deservedly popular such people are. Of which deserving community was Miss Vipart. Encouraged by the notes of interrogation in his companion's eyes, Gabriel continued: "During the last few weeks a great change has come into my life. I have learnt for the first time all that a woman can be to a man, both as a help and an inspiration. I have learnt how she can strengthen him when he is weak, and uphold him when he is strong; how she can heal him when he is sick, and comfort him when he is sorrowful; in short, how she can be to him all that God meant her to be when he created her as an helpmeet for man." "And who has taught you all this, Mr. Carr?" Fabia knew all the moves of the game. "You. No one but you. When first I heard you sing, I had a faint glimmering of all that you could be to me if you cared: and every time that I have seen you since, this truth has grown brighter and clearer. So now, my beloved, I come to ask you the greatest of all favours that a man can ask of a woman. I ask you to be my wife." Fabia hesitated. She did not love the man. She knew that she did not: but he looked so handsome as he proffered his impassioned appeal that his beauty was almost irresistible to her. And then she wanted to be married to an Englishman, to have an assured position of her own. He was poor, but what of that? She had money enough and to spare for both. And although she did not love him, she was nearer to loving him than she had ever been to loving any man yet, as near, in fact, as she believed it was in her nature to be. And he was so very goodly to look upon. "Fabia, my darling, I am waiting for your answer," and his voice, as he spoke to her, was as beautiful as his face. "I believe that I could make you happy, and I know that you could make me more absolutely blissful than it has ever yet been any man's lot to be." Still Fabia was silent, and no sound broke the stillness save the hum of summer in the air. "My beloved, won't you speak to me and tell me that at any rate I may hope?" urged the man after an interminable pause. Then Fabia spoke. "Yes, I will marry you," she said, "but only on one condition." And she had not the faintest idea that her condition was in any way a hard one. In fact, she considered that it would be to Gabriel's advantage as much as to hers. "And what is that, my dearest? Though whatever it is already granted." And he stretched out both arms to her in passionate longing. "I will marry you on condition that you will give up being a clergyman and come abroad with me. There is no need for you to work, as I have plenty of money, and besides you are not strong enough for it. We will say farewell to England for a time, and travel everywhere and see the world together, you and I." She really felt that she could not endure the lot of a clergyman's wife in an East End parish, and she did not see why she should. The outstretched arms fell limply to his sides. He could not believe that he had heard aright. "What? Give up my orders? I do not know what you mean." But Fabia continued unabashed, thinking that she was asking but a very little thing. "I only mean that you must give up your work and live to enjoy yourself and to see the world. There is so much to be seen, and so little time to see it in, and most people have either not the time or the money to see it at all. But you and I will have both the time and the money, and there is nothing that we will not see. We will wander about at our own sweet will, and will pry into all the secret places of the earth. We will turn our backs upon this provincial English ignorance, and will be as gods, knowing good and evil." She spoke with unusual animation, for the picture she was drawing of their future life together fascinated her, and the more she thought of it, the more certain she felt that this was the lot which could make her happy, far happier than anything which Charlie Gaythorne had to offer. There was a nomadic strain in her blood, a longing for the wild freedom of desert places, and the mere thought of the home-staying existence of the Gaythornes of Gaythorne fairly suffocated her. "Yes," she went on, "there is nothing that shall come between us and the fulfilment of our desires. Whatever we wish to do, that we will do. We will have no dreary English estate, with its tenants and its responsibilities always dragging at our heels. But, like Bacon, we will take all nature for our province. Truly, we will see the world, and then, when we have seen all that there is to be seen, and are growing old and weary, we will settle down in some southern place as beautiful as a dream, and will drowse away the remainder of our days in the sunshine." Thus she spoke, carried away by the vision that her own words conjured up, and intoxicated by the thought of her coming happiness. And as he listened, Gabriel's love for her fell dead at his feet, slain by her own hand. The intrinsic royalty of his priesthood rose up in his soul and spurned the base suggestion that had just been made to him. Gabriel the man was merged in Gabriel the priest. His love for the woman was extinguished in his scorn for the blasphemer who had thus dared to lay profane hands upon the very ark of God. In his eyes they had ceased to be man and woman. She was but the sacrilegious person who had defiled the holy place, and he was the judge and the avenger. She had tampered with that which was dearer to him than life itself, the sanctity of his priesthood, and in so doing had placed herself forever, as far as he was concerned, beyond the pale. "Fabia," he cried, "do you know what you are saying? You tempt me to commit the unpardonable sin as glibly as you would ask me to walk across the lawn. You have insulted me and defied the God whom I serve. All is over forever between us. If you repent, I cannot deny you absolution as a priest, but I will never more grant you friendship as a man." And he turned on his heel and left her. Fabia sat still for a minute as one stunned. It was all so strange, so unexpected. But with her usual quickness of perception, she at once realized what she had done. She knew that she had offended Gabriel past any possibility of reconciliation, that all was over between them. And she also knew that when the priest in him rose up and made him more than man, he was for the first time stronger than she and was her master, and that at that moment she had learned to love him. Just as she made this all-important and most disconcerting discovery, who should come sauntering up but Charlie Gaythorne, with a cigar in his mouth and a proposal in his eye. No sooner did he espy the vacant place at Fabia's side than he flung his cigar and his caution alike to the winds, and set to work with all the dogged determination of an Englishman and a soldier. He succinctly and tersely conveyed to Fabia's mind the importance of the compliment she was going to receive, and for which she had every reason to be truly thankful. Charlie was not much of a talker as a rule, but when he had anything to say, he said it, and this happened to be one of those rare occasions. With regard to their respective social positions, he extenuated nothing, nor set down aught in malice. He was too much of a gentleman either to brag about his own advantages or to underrate hers. But he was also far too simple and transparent to hide from Fabia what a magnificent opening he considered it for any woman to be invited to succeed his august parent as mistress of Gaythorne Manor. And strange to say, it was this very argument, which at another time would only have roused Fabia's wrath and scorn, that on this particular occasion won the day. She could see what a grand thing Charlie thought it was to be Mrs. Gaythorne. She knew that Charlie's world looked at things very much from Charlie's point of view. And she wanted to do something that would win for her the respect of other people and restore to her her own. She was feeling hurt and lonely, and there is no atmosphere so conducive to the acceptance of offers of marriage as the atmosphere of pained desolation. Gabriel's rebuff had left her sore and wounded to the death, and she felt that she could not go on living unless something were done to bring her wounded spirit ease. And this seemed the very thing that was needed. As Charlie's wife, she would have an assured position and a devoted husband, the two finest supporters possible for a female coat of arms. True, she did not love him, and she did love Gabriel, but she was clever enough to know when a thing was beyond her reach, wherein she was superior to the majority of her sex, and too clever to waste her time in striving to attain the unattainable. Gabriel would never marry her now. Charlie would. So she decided to marry Charlie. Charlie, of course, was in the seventh heaven of delight. It never occurred to him that he had anything or anybody but himself to thank for the success of his wooing. He had not yet learnt that in many cases it is the hour rather than the man that is responsible for a woman's yes. If a suitor will only time his opportunity correctly, he can generally ensure the advantage or disadvantage of being accepted. Gabriel, meanwhile, was engaged in a sore struggle with himself. True, his love for Fabia fell dead on the spot when she trampled upon his highest ideals and his most sacred beliefs by asking him to renounce his orders for her sake. But love, even when dead, is not obliterated, but still requires decent burial and a suitable period of mourning. Carr's first impulse was to go right away from Vernacre and never to look upon Fabia's face again. But reflection showed him that such a course, though the most comfortable as far as he was concerned, would be most uncomfortable for everybody else, and would therefore partake of the nature of selfishness. And Gabriel had too much of the true woman in his character ever to be guilty of selfishness in any form. He knew that it would upset things generally, and most especially his host, who was a regular old bachelor with regard to the inviolability of even the smallest plan, if a guest who had arranged to stay until Tuesday fled incontinently upon Sunday afternoon. And Gabriel, always more ready to consider others than himself, decided to spare Lord Wrexham this avoidable agony. Moreover, he felt that by making his speedy escape from the scene of his disappointment and disillusion, he would put both himself and Fabia in a false position. So he decided to bury his own suffering out of sight, and to behave, as far as in him lay, for the rest of his visit to Vernacre as if nothing had happened, in order that other people should not be made uncomfortable by his distress, wherein he showed himself both a woman and a gentleman. A most admirable, if rare, combination. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of the Subjection of Isabel Carnaby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby by Ellen Thorneycroft Fowler. Chapter 10. Gabriel the Pastor. On the following day, as soon as lunch was over and the company had variously distributed themselves as they thought fit, Isabel Seton and Gabriel Carr went for a walk together. They were great friends, and had been so ever since they first met, not long after Isabel's marriage, and each enjoyed a talk with the other after the fashion of iron sharpening iron. They passed out of the garden and into the park, and then began the ascent of a grassy hill which culminated in the finest view in the country, and as they went they talked by the way. It was a glorious afternoon, one of those perfect days of early summer when the world is ablaze with colour. Every tree of the field had a particular green of its own, unlike the green of any of its fellows, and the banks were carpeted with flowers. "Has it ever struck you," asked Gabriel, "that summer is the carnival of colour, as winter is the carnival of form? If you love colour, you will prefer the summer woods, but if form appeals to you, you will revel in the leafless trees." "To tell the truth, it never did, but now you mention it, I feel as if the idea were my own. And this further explains why I like summer so much better than winter, for the same reason that I spend hours among the pictures in the Academy, and only minutes among the sculpture. I love colour, and don't care for form. Everything has a colour to me, even sounds." Gabriel's face was filled with interest. He loved new ideas, and failing them, he liked to find new garments for old ones, as he had learnt the cramping effects of stereotyped forms. "How do you mean?" "It is rather difficult to explain, but I seem unconsciously to translate sound into colour before I can understand it. For instance, to me all the vowel sounds are represented by different colours." "How very interesting! What colour is A? A is green, and E is blue, and I is white, and O is orange, and U is purple." "And what about W and Y? Haven't they got colours also?" "Oh yes, of course they have. W is red, and Y is yellow." "And why did you choose these particular colours for the vowel sounds?" asked Carr. "There is no why or wherefore, and I didn't choose them at all. To me A is green and E is blue, just as the grass is green and the sky is blue. There is no choice or reason in the matter. It is simply how they appear to me." "Have other sounds colour to you also?" "Yes, voices have. Soprano voices are pale blue or green or yellow or white. Contraltos are pink or red or violet, and tenors are different shades of brown, and basses are black or dark green or navy blue." "Anything else?" "Yes, nearly everything. The days of the week, for instance, have different colours." "And what are they?" "Monday is green, and Tuesday pink, and Wednesday blue, and Thursday brown, and Friday purple, and Saturday yellow, and Sunday white. Colour is everything to me, and everything to me has colour." Carr looked at her thoughtfully. "Yes, you are the type of woman who would be sure to love colour." "Why?" "Because what is vivid appeals to you more than what is suggestive; because what is expressed touches you more than what is understood." Isabel tossed her head. "You don't mean that altogether as a compliment." "Perhaps not: yet certainly not as the reverse. I was merely stating a fact, and not drawing any deduction from it either one way or the other." "I see: you were giving me the heads without the application. I think I like that sort of sermon best. Heads or tails? I mean heads or applications? I say heads, and let the applications take care of themselves." "It is the application that will do you the most good, Mrs. Seaton." "Very well, then. Here's for the application, and I'll swallow it whole. To be well shaken before taken, I suppose." "I'll shake the head and swallow the application, and so all parties will be satisfied." Gabriel smiled. "But I have just said that there is no application. You can't swallow what doesn't exist." "Can't I, though? I've been swallowing the principles of the extreme Radical party for years." "I'm afraid you are rather disloyal to that section of the Liberal party to which your husband belongs," remonstrated Gabriel. Isabel's face grew grave. "I'm not really. I was only joking. Only I see the mistakes into which it is rushing, and I want to save it from them. And most especially do I want to save Paul from making of mistakes and the disappointment which they bring." "Why?" Isabel looked at her companion with surprise that he should have wasted time and breath in asking of so unnecessary a question. "Because I love him, and therefore wish to spare him pain." "Pardon me: there is no 'therefore' in that sentence. Pain may be good, may be necessary for a person, and in that case, because you loved him, you would not wish to spare him pain." "But I do. I hate Paul to be vexed about anything." "You mustn't spoil him. You are his wife, not his mother." "It doesn't do for a wife's affection for her husband to be too maternal. It stunts his spiritual growth." "But a woman must be maternal to somebody." And there was that pathetic ring in Isabel's voice which always went to Paul's heart. Gabriel heard it, and it touched him also. "I know," he answered very gently: "but not to her husband, if she will make a man of him. Besides, it is all the wrong way about. The husband is the head of the wife, and this is in accordance with God's ordinance: but we don't pet our rulers." Isabel's face grew perplexed. "Then do you mean to say that a woman ought to obey her husband, even when she knows better than he does?" "Certainly: even when she thinks that she knows better than he does." Gabriel amended the sentence. Isabel was quick to notice the amendment and to resent it. "But knowing better isn't merely a matter of opinion." "Pardon me: I think not infrequently it is. People say, 'If I were so and so, I should do such and such a thing.' So they would: but that doesn't prove that it would be a better or a wiser thing than what so and so is actually doing. It would merely be a different thing: that is all. If I say that I know better than you how to do something, it only means that I know better how to do it in my particular way. It doesn't follow that my way is any better than yours, or even as good." Isabel was unconvinced. This was not palatable doctrine to a woman who was as sure of herself as she was. But the fact that that doctrine is unpalatable in no way detracts from its salutariness — frequently the reverse. "Can't you understand," she persisted, "that if a woman loves her husband she naturally wants to prevent him from making mistakes? She can't do that. Everybody must make mistakes. All that she can do is to induce him to make her mistakes instead of his own. She won't make him wise: she will only substitute her particular brand of folly for his, and for the life of me I cannot see any great advantage in that. A man would far rather make his own mistakes than anybody else's, even than of his wife's. His own natural mistakes are in drawing with the rest of his character, and assumed ones are not." "Then you think it is a mistake for wives to interfere too much in their husband's public life?" Although Isabel might not like Gabriel's advice, she was sufficiently just to weigh it, and to give it full consideration. She was always an eminently reasonable woman — at least nearly always. "A very great mistake — often a fatal mistake." Carr spoke strongly. He was sore after yesterday's interview with Fabia, and filled with horror at the mere idea of how she, had she been his wife, would have used her influence to his soul's undoing. Our opinions are always tinged by our experience, and the more recent the experience, the deeper the tinge. "But you wouldn't object half so much to a husband who tried to stop his wife from making mistakes," said Isabel shrewdly. "That is a totally different thing. I believe that a woman's place is to look on and cheer and lighten and help, rather than to dictate or do the work herself. I always think that line of Charles Kingsley's, 'Three wives sat up in the lighthouse tower, trimming the lamps as the sun went down,' conveys a very fair idea of woman's place and duty. It is a wife's place to sit up aloft in the lighthouse tower, above the sordid cares and struggles of the business world, and to trim the lights for her husband, so that he may be guided in the right way, even though his sun be gone down. But it is not her place to embark on the high seas of business or politics, and try to steer his boat for him." Mrs. Seaton tossed her head, as she always did when annoyed or indignant. It was a favourite gesture of hers. "Well, I don't see why it should be all right for a man to dictate to his wife, and all wrong for a woman to dictate to her husband. I don't see why a woman's advice to her husband should be a treasonable document, and a husband's advice to his wife a signed and sealed Act of Parliament." "Because God ordained it so. There is no other reason." Isabel was silent, partly because she did not know exactly what to say, and partly because she had not much breath with which to say it, as they had reached the steepest part of the hill just below the summit. The two walked, or rather climbed, on for a few minutes without speaking, and then they reached the top of the hill, and the whole glorious stretch of country at their feet suddenly was revealed to their view. It was one of those typical English landscapes, with green foregrounds and blue distances, with near woodlands and distant hills, which can never be actually described to anyone who has not seen them, and which need no description to us who know and love them, for to us they spell the magic word home. "Isn't it magnificent?" exclaimed Isabel, after they had gazed for a few minutes in awestruck silence. "It fairly takes away one's breath — at least as much of it as the ascent has left. It does. It is a wonderful view." "And so thoroughly English, and therefore so satisfying," Isabel continued. "Have you ever noticed that foreign scenery, however beautiful and magnificent, leaves you with a restless, hungry sort of feeling, but that a perfect English landscape such as this seems to soak into every little crevice of your soul and make you quite peaceful and content?" "I have.
I know exactly what you mean. It is an older sort of feeling than the other, but much more comfortable." "Older sorts of feeling are generally the most comfortable," said Isabel sagely. "When you are young you are so anxious to see what is going to happen that you skip the book of daily life in order to get on with the story. But as you get older you think more of the style and the characters and the dialogue than of the plot, and so you are better able to enjoy and appreciate the work as a whole." Again the two friends were silent, dwelling on the beauty of the scene before them. Gabriel took off his hat and let the soft breeze cool his forehead, and as he did so the misery which Fabia had brought upon him faded away like a mist, and once more he saw plain. But his companion's eyes grew grave, and there was a pathetic droop at the corner of her mouth. "Isn't it funny," she suddenly remarked, "that there is always something rather sad about the top of a hill? As long as you are climbing you are full of joy and energy and hope: but when you get to the top everything changes, and you almost wish the hill had been a bit higher, so that you might still be on the climb. It is the same with everything. We envy the people who have arrived, and who have attained the summit of their respective ambitions: yet if we were wise in our envying, and directed it judiciously, we should rather envy those who are still swarming up the slopes. Hill tops on the whole are rather sorrowful places." And Isabel sighed. "A somewhat pessimistic doctrine, Mrs. Seaton, to be enunciated by one of the most popular and successful women in London," said Gabriel with a smile. "Nevertheless a true one." "I think not." Isabel raised her eyebrows. She had a great theory that it was the duty of the clergy to offer ample advice to the laity on all questions moral and spiritual: that a clergyman was a specialist in spiritual matters, just as a doctor was a specialist in physical ones. Nevertheless she was always slightly ruffled when the ghostly counsel which she so freely sought did not altogether tally with her own preconceived notions on any subject. Wherein she was distinctly feminine, both in her longing for priestly assistance and her rejection of it when found. "Well, anyhow, S. Paul agreed with me," she retorted. "He particularly mentions that he was always pressing forward and had never attained." She felt that this was a clinching argument, and that an alliance between the apostle of the Gentiles and Mrs. Seaton formed an authority which few theologians would dare to dispute. "And surely you'll admit that S. Paul was a past master in the art of contentment." "Certainly," replied Gabriel. "And why was he content? Because he hadn't reached the top of the hill." There was triumph as well as finality in Mrs. Seaton's tone. "Pardon me, he had reached the top of a good many hills: but he had learnt what you apparently forgot, Mrs. Seaton, namely, that when we have gained the summit of one hill, there are always plenty of higher ones still for us to climb." "Oh!" Isabel had not a good answer ready, so wisely confined herself to the monosyllable. Carr continued, "I understand the feeling to which you refer, the sadness of the hill tops: but believe me, it is an ignoble sadness. It either means that we are too easily satisfied with our achievements, and have neither the strength nor the courage to persevere: or else it means that the hill we have just climbed was not worth the climbing, in which case it was a pity that we ever wasted our time and trouble on it at all." "I see. It hadn't occurred to me to look at it in that light." Isabel spoke slowly. She was always ready to see when she was in the wrong, although it must be admitted that the sight was not altogether an agreeable one to her. "S. Paul had not only mastered the art of content," Carr went on, "but he had also mastered as well the art of discontent. He knew how to be abased as well as how to abound." "I believe you are right: but somehow that hill top sadness seemed to me to be rather a beautiful and interesting sort of thing. I quite piqued myself on it." "You would do," replied Gabriel with a smile. "Sadness is always beautiful and interesting to us as long as we are young and have never met it face to face." "It was rather young of me, I confess. You must admit that I was old enough to know better." "Nevertheless you didn't know better, Mrs. Seaton." Isabel, as usual, was quite ready to laugh at herself. "I think you may take it as an axiom," continued Carr, "that when you feel what you call the sadness of the hilltop, the particular hill in question was not worth the climbing. It is a pretty fair test. The hills that are worth climbing always lead us on to other hills that are still more worth climbing, and thus are formed the great world's altar stairs which slope through darkness up to God. Therefore there is no time for sadness, no place for it either. Yes, yes, you are right and I was wrong. And after all, I'm rather glad that there is no occasion for that particular sort of sadness, though I must admit I've rather enjoyed it at times. But all sadness is really horrid underneath, however nice and interesting it may appear on the surface, isn't it?" Gabriel demurred. He was not going to commit himself to so sweeping a statement. "My husband never suffers from the hilltop sadness," continued Isabel. "The moment he has topped one hill he is bounding off to another like a young hart. The fact that his hills are not worth the climbing has no effect upon him. Your husband is still very young. I know he is, much younger than I am, though he was really born a year and a half earlier. That has nothing to do with it. Not it. Age is a matter of temperament rather than of time. Everybody is a certain age by nature, and the number of years we happen to have dwelt on this planet is merely an incident which is nobody's business but our own. Nothing will make my husband more than 19, however long he lives, while I was 33 and a half before I left my cradle. You are about 25 and always will be, and Wrexham has never gone below 84 since he was born. And what is our dear Mrs. Gaythorne? A good 55, with exuberant prejudices keeping off age on the one hand, and misplaced convictions staving off youth on the other." Gabriel could not fail to appreciate this description. He knew Mrs. Gaythorne so well. Isabel went on. "It is Paul's youngness that makes him so ready to scale heights that are not worth the scaling, and my oldness that makes me want to hold him back." Gabriel looked at her thoughtfully. This woman always interested him. She was so full of contradictions, so fresh and so blasé, so wise and so thoughtless, so gay and so serious, all at the same time. But in spite of her fascination for him, he felt it his duty to administer to her ghostly counsel and reproof, and having seen his duty, he was not the man to postpone it to a more convenient season. "I think you are wrong in trying to hold him back," he said quietly. Isabel started. She was not accustomed to being reproved or found fault with, and she did not like it: but she liked it better than not being talked about at all, and so she continued the discussion with apparent if not sincere humility. "Why am I wrong? He'd make most awful blunders if I didn't." "So you have remarked before, and so I still presume to doubt. But even if that is so, you have no right to hamper and hinder him." "Why not, I should like to know?" "In the first place, because you are his wife, and so are in subjection to him, and are bound to obey and serve him by your own vow: and in the second place, because his readiness to attempt the ascent of what you consider unscalable mountains shows that he has more faith than you have, and so is farther advanced in the spiritual life." Isabel fairly gasped. She had decided to reverence her husband, and was fully convinced that she did, according to the dictates of Holy Scripture: but her idea of reverence was a combination of indulgent tolerance with restrained superiority. It is an idea which obtains among many otherwise excellent wives. "I shouldn't call it exactly faith," she objected. "Why not? That is its name," said Gabriel. "I see: and so you call it by it, just as you call a spade, and Branson's extract of coffee perfection. But I should not call it faith as long as it was only applied to political things. I should call it faith if it was applied to religious things. Oh dear, you are every bit as bad as a suburban tradesman." I am always trying in vain to convince my very respectable and superior parishioners that there are no such things as religious things. All things are religious, or else nothing is. There is no middle course. Religion either permeates every thought and act and object of a man's life, or else it never really touches anything in it at all. I hate the cant which sets a boundary between what is religious and what is secular, so called, for unless a man's religion touches everything about him and around him and within him, that man's religion is vain. It was a hard saying, but Gabriel could be hard at times. He was no rose-water sentimentalist. The world has no idea," he went on rapidly, "of the stupendous power of faith. Men say that the age of miracles is past, but that is not so. It is the age of faith which makes miracles possible that is past." "Then do you think that if a man had only faith enough he could scale every mountain?" "Scale it? Why, he could say to it, 'Be thou removed, and cast into the midst of the sea,' and it would be done." I believe there is nothing that a man could not do if only he had enough faith; no miracle that he could not perform. The present age is not an age of faith, it is an age of charity. We build infirmaries and we endow hospitals, but we no longer lay hands on the sick that they may recover. Silver and gold we have, and we use it on the whole beneficially, but we no longer bid a man take up his bed and walk. Yet this ought we to do, and not to leave the other undone." "Do you think that this lack of faith is felt in all the churches?" asked Isabel. "I do. I think that in the present day religion is to the Roman a passion, to the Anglican a principle, and to the Nonconformist an emotion. But I think that to many of them it is not the power of God to salvation, both of body and soul, that it might be, if there were more faith on the earth. Otherwise we should still have the miracles of the early church and of the Middle Ages and of the evangelical revival." "You are quite right. The want of faith of the present day is something dreadful. It always sickens me to hear people talk as they do of remarkable answers to prayer. Yet these people would see nothing remarkable at all in an answer to a telegram. It seems a queer sort of belief that strains at the faithfulness of God, and then swallows without an effort the infallibility of a telegraph boy." "It does indeed. Yet it is essentially the belief of the present day and generation." The two were walking down the hill again by this time, and Carr's face was aglow with the enthusiasms that were stirring within him. It was in matters spiritual that he was always most at home. The secular emotions, such as love, ambition, and the like, though not exactly foreign to his nature, were not quite in perfect harmony with it. But his companion's face was grave. She was made of slighter elements than he, and it was the more human and personal side of life that touched her most closely. Gabriel would have made a splendid monk, but Isabel could never have been anything but fifth rate as a nun. Therefore she suddenly harked back to that point in the conversation where Carr had turned away from earth and began to soar heavenward. "You said firstly, because I am his wife and therefore am in subjection to him," she began. "What did you mean by that?" With the quick sympathy and ready adaptability of the man who has been trained for the priesthood, Gabriel fell in with her mood at once. "I mean exactly what S. Peter meant when he first said it," he replied, "neither more nor less. 'Likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands.' It seems quite plain speaking." It is the fashion nowadays, in this very enlightened age, to talk much, and not always kindly, of the faults and failings of the clergy, of those peculiarities which distinguish them as a body from their lay brethren. But what about the special virtues which are theirs by right of their clerical training, and in which the laity are conspicuously lacking? The intuition, the sympathy, the self-repression, the self-control, which we take as a matter of course in our spiritual pastors, but which we frequently seek in vain in the successful tradesman or the man of affairs. When the enemy has found occasion to blaspheme, and is availing himself of the same, it is a favourite jibe of his to discover points of resemblance between clergymen and women. And he is right. As a rule, a clergyman, more than any other man, has the power of discovering other people's joys and sorrows, and throwing himself into them, in a way that is popularly supposed to be the prerogative of the weaker sex. His very calling trains him to suppress his own wants and wishes in attending to the wants and wishes of his flock, just as a woman is trained to suppress her own wants and wishes in attending to the wants and wishes of her family. The ordinary male is not so trained. As a rule, other people do not bother him with their troubles, nor does he bother them with his. He neither offers sympathy nor demands it. He is more like a child than a woman, possessing childlike simplicity and straightforwardness rather than feminine subtlety and intuition. Thanks to Gabriel's clerical training, he understood pretty well what was passing in his companion's mind as she walked beside him in silence for a few moments. He knew that her sound common sense was at war with her husband's idealism, and that her womanly wilfulness was at variance with her wifely submission. But he meant to tell her the truth when she gave him an opportunity, and if she did not give him an opportunity, he meant to make one. But she did. Supposing a wife really knows better than her husband, she argued, and that the grey mare is a 24 horsepower motor car, do you think even then she ought to obey and reverence him? Not a doubt of it, my dear Mrs. Seaton. Of course she should influence him to the utmost of her ability, and give him as good advice as she can, when he is taking any, but she must never forget that by right of his office the husband is the head of the wife. Even if he is an inferior article? Certainly. As a churchwoman, you believe that the unworthiness of the priest in no way interferes with the efficacy of the sacraments. As a British citizen, you admit that the personal character of a judge in no way affects the validity of his sentences. And as a wife, you must therefore accept the fact that the faults and failings of a man in no way obviate his prerogative as a husband. Isabel shrugged her shoulders. You hold the doctrine that the king can do no wrong. I do, and I consider it a very sound doctrine too. Of course, as a man he can do wrong, but as a king he cannot, because the king and the priest and the judge and the husband are all in their own way and for the time being the ambassadors and representatives of God, and in reverencing them, we reverence the divine authority which is for the moment vested in them, and submit ourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Isabel looked up with a glance of warm approbation. How nicely you put things! You have such a richly decorative mind that you make quite common things seem positively gorgeous. Do quite common things refer to kings or to husbands? Asked Carr with a smile. Neither the one nor the other in particular, and, roughly speaking, both. But you have a knack of sticking halos on to everything and everybody, and somehow transfiguring them. I never knew anyone like you at the halo business, except a few occasional sunsets and certain hymns. There are some hymn tunes that have precisely the same effect on me that you have, make me feel good and glorified and treading on air. I am glad to hear it. Just now I feel as if I couldn't wait another minute without flying to Paul, and implicitly obeying him in something that I know to be utterly absurd. At the present moment I could die for a lost cause, or start a woman's liberal federation without turning a hair. I could indeed. And all because Paul is my husband, and you've stuck a halo onto him. But I didn't make him your husband. You will admit that. I may have arranged the halo, but it was you who agreed to the wearing of the wedding ring. There was a certain amount of free will in the business after all, Mrs. Seaton. Your king may reign by divine right. I believe he does. But remember, you elected him yourself in the first instance." "So I did, and I'm very glad I did. And if there was another election to morrow, he'd still be at the top of the poll. Which reminds me that we are at the bottom of the hill, and I'll run and find him and obey him this very minute, and tell him how kind you have been in fastening a bit of string to his halo, for fear it should get blown off when things are slightly breezy. I must say there is a danger of husbands' halos blowing off if they are not properly fastened on. But now Paul's is secured, thanks to you, with an elastic band under his chin, like a little boy's hat, and unless he deliberately takes it off, nothing can remove it." "I have known husbands deliberately take them off," said Gabriel. "So have I, to some passing lady of their acquaintance, and then the wives can't always put them on again. But thank heaven Paul isn't that sort. If ever his halo does tumble off, you can be sure it is I who have knocked it off. It wouldn't be his fault, poor darling." "Certainly it would not. So be careful that you never do such a thing, Mrs. Seaton." Isabel laughed good humouredly. "Not I. It is all very well for the sergeant at arms to call hats off, but if he begins calling halos off, I shall protest. It would never do for my husband to be without his halo. It would be so cold for him, and so dark for me, and so generally horrid all round." Chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of the Subjection of Isabel Carnaby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby by Ellen Thornycroft Fowler. Chapter 11. Janet Field. When the Whitsuntide party at Vernacre broke up, Gabriel went to complete his enforced holiday and regain his enfeebled strength at his mother's home in a small midland village about 4 miles from Merchester. It was an ideal house for a widow lady of limited means, not more than a cottage in size and design, but stamped all over with the indelible and indescribable signs of refinement and ladyhood. The way in which it draped itself with creepers was modesty personified, and suggested all the sensitiveness and refinement which are associated with flowing veils and lace shawls. Its windows were so shaded with soft greenery that they could not properly lift their eyelids and face the sunshine, and its chimneys were so clothed with the same that only the smoke, which now and again emerged from their half-shut mouths, proclaimed them to be anything so commonplace and obvious as chimneys at all. Which things were symbolical of the character of the owner of the cottage, who had never called a spade, nor looked a bare fact in the face since the day she was born. Evelyn Carr was one of those people who are known in their youth as lovely young creatures, and in their later life as sweet women. She was tall and slight, with fair hair and blue eyes, and a complexion that retained its apple blossom tint even until the late autumn of life. She was elegant rather than stylish, lovable rather than fascinating. She was amiability incarnate, and unselfish to the verge of insipidity, and in fact possessed all the virtues excepting strength, courage, and a sense of humour. It really would have been difficult, even had her friends and acquaintances been so uncharitably inclined, to find any actual fault in Mrs. Carr's character. The absence of certain excellencies was the worst of which any one could accuse her. That she had left undone sundry things which she ought to have done was sufficiently within the range of probability to entitle her to take her part in the general confession. But that she had ever done anything that she ought not to have done was hardly credible to any one who enjoyed the pleasure of Mrs. Carr's acquaintance.
Her mind was cultured and refined, but it was always enveloped in a soft haze, too indistinct to be called a mist, and too intangible to be described as a fog. Her distinguishing characteristic, if such a term could be applied to a character where everything was indistinguishable, was vagueness, vagueness in thought, in belief, and in conversation. In strong contrast to Mrs. Carr was her adopted daughter, Janet Field. Janet was no blood relation of Mrs. Carr's. If she had been, her claim would have been too obvious to appeal to that excellent lady. She was the only child of a fellow officer of Eveline's husband. Her father was killed in action a few months after her birth, and her mother did not long survive him. And the very fact that the infant had no claim whatsoever upon Mrs. Carr's charity was the strongest claim that the child could possibly have had. The only thing needed to clinch this appeal and to make it final and irresistible was the fact that the child should be utterly destitute and unable to repay Mrs. Carr for any of the care and expense which that good woman was prepared freely to lavish upon her. And this recommendation the poor baby possessed to the full. Therefore Mrs. Carr, being herself the widow of a young officer in very straitened circumstances, with a boy of her own to bring up and educate, saw no reason why she should not at once apply for the vacant post of little Janet Field's mother, and the child's relations, being ordinary selfish human beings, were only too glad to take advantage of the pretty young widow's inexperience and impracticability, and to shift the expense and care of the child from their shoulders on to hers, which they promptly did, and then washed their hands of all further responsibility, thereby resigning forever in favour of Eveline Carr their vested interest in all the blessings pertaining to the great, inasmuch as ye did it to one of the least of these. So it came to pass that Gabriel Carr and Janet Field were brought up as brother and sister, she being a few years younger than he. Janet proved to be a most admirable and healthy element in the Carr household, whilst Gabriel was idealistic and theoretic, and his mother absolutely indistinct. Janet was the embodiment of definite clearness. There was no vagueness about her, no atmosphere even. The lights and shadows in her mind were as clearly defined as the lights and shadows in an Egyptian photograph. Even the grey matter in her brain could hardly have been so indefinite a colour as grey, as it is in the case of the rest of us. It must really have been actual black and white, or else it never could have formed a part of Janet. Janet not only knew exactly what she herself thought upon every subject under the sun, she also knew that hers was the only point of view compatible with wisdom and honesty, a most comfortable form of knowledge. She treated Mrs. Carr with unwearying indulgence and maternal solicitude. The latter believed that she had adopted Janet, but in reality Janet had adopted her. And she worshipped Gabriel with that absolute devotion which combines the love of sister and of wife, and which is never felt save by those who fall in love as women with the men whom they played with as children. In appearance Janet was by no means as handsome as the Carrs, but she was very pleasant looking, and not without a charm of her own. She was under rather than over the medium height, and inclined to be plump rather than slight. Her hair was brown and her eyes hazel, and she had a bright pink colour in her rounded cheeks. It never occurred to Gabriel to fall in love with her, as she had long ago fallen in love with him. Men keep the conjugal and fraternal affections much farther apart than women do. When a man promises to be a brother to a woman, he means to be a brother to her, neither more nor less, with all a brother's reserves and limitations. But when a woman promises to be a sister to a man, well, if she does not mean him to make love to her, she means something singularly like it. It was to this little household that Gabriel came straight from Vernacre, and highly delighted were both these loving women to welcome him. They showed this delight in their respective ways, his mother by putting vases of flowers on his dressing-table, which upset themselves and baptized him with unclean water every time that he attempted to brush his hair, and Janet by seeing that his bed was aired and his wardrobe emptied of those overflow garments which are so apt to gather themselves together in the spare room of every small house. "I don't think Gabriel is looking at all well," Janet remarked to Mrs. Carr the first time after his arrival that he left them together. Gabriel's mother looked up from her knitting with a dreamy smile. "Don't you, love? It hadn't occurred to me, as he never has much colour, his dear father having been pale with such chiselled features, which are the prerogative of the Carr family, and came over with William the Conqueror and settled there. A very old family, and always such beautifully shaped hands. My boy is wonderfully like his dear father, only a clergyman, the clerical dress making a certain amount of difference from uniform, and black, of course, always causing any one to look paler than in scarlet. I know that Gabriel is never rosy, but I am sure that now he looks paler and more tired than usual," Janet persisted. "No, my boy was never ruddy, though of a fair countenance, like David and Goliath, which I always feel is sin, and his sermons are like the stones which he put in his sling, and so fought against the enemy and prevailed, though I cannot help thinking that a country parish would be better for him, especially in the hot weather. It is so difficult sometimes to reconcile one's duty with what is best for one's health, like the pay in the Indian army being so much bigger than at home, and yet so hard to choose between leaving one's husband alone in India or one's children alone in England. And I never think that female relations, however kind, are quite the same as one's own mother, though I am sure, dearest, I have always tried to do my duty by you." To live with Mrs. Carr and to listen to all she said would have made life impossible. Janet never attempted or pretended to do it. "I am sure he is working much too hard on Eveline." Mrs. Carr was the type of woman who always insists on being called aunt by all young persons not related to her by the ties of kinship. "Do you think so, dearest? Still, after all, youth is the time for work, before the night cometh when no man can work, or even take a canonry or a rural parish. I am always hoping that in the future my Gabriel will be given a canonry by some of his influential friends, and a sweet home in some secluded close, if not a rural parish with a good stipend, and a substantial Easter offering, and one sermon a week, with the curate preaching the other, and that not always a new one." "It worried me, his taking that suburban place," continued the imperturbable Janet. "It meant so much struggling and working it up, and he was completely worn out already by his work in the slums. I was always against St. Etheldreda's, as you know." "Still, darling, when a distinct call comes, it seems hardly right to disregard it, since, as our duty is so shall our strength be, even in a town parish without a curate and no endowment to speak of. We must have faith according to our needs." "And rich people must have charity according to their means," retorted Janet, "or else how can the work of the Church be carried on? I always think that the clergy of the Church of England are horribly underpaid. Nonconformists would scorn to be as stingy with their ministers as we are with ours." "Yes, dearest, I have heard that said by quite clever people as a proof of disestablishment or disendowment, or something of that kind. But to my mind there is a solidity about a state church which the world cannot give nor take away, even though the stipend be inadequate, and often such large families. An established church seems to me like family prayers in a private household, beginning the day with an open acknowledgment that God is the head of everything, and regarded as such even by the most worldly and ambitious." "All the same, Aunt Eveline, I think that the living of St. Etheldreda's is too hard work and too little pay for Gabriel." "Well, love, since you think it, I'll send in to Marchester by the carrier to-morrow and get him a bottle of that tonic, which did me so much good just after dear Gabriel was born. I frequently take it when I am at all run down, and find it of the greatest benefit. A mixture of quinine and iron for exhaustion and lassitude in water exactly half an hour after food." Mrs. Carr was the type of woman who usually relies upon home-made remedies for ordinary infirmities of the flesh, but who in more urgent cases will now and again meet the emergency by a bottle of medicine from the chemist's. To such women the advent of the doctor is on a par with the commendatory prayers. But the wise Janet shook her head. "Prevention is better than cure," she said, "and it is wiser to avoid being ill at all than to cure yourself by taking medicine." "Of course, dear love, I admit that a stitch in time saves many a bottle of doctor's stuff, and is less upsetting to the digestion, many people not being able to assimilate iron without headache and quinine in a liquid form. But for such people there are always pills, and so much more convenient if you are lunching or dining out. All the same, I am wretched about Gabriel. I am sure he isn't well, and he isn't happy. I saw it the moment he entered the house. It was not easy to turn Miss Field from any matter on which her attention had alighted. He may not be well, my darling, but I am sure he is happy, since happiness consists in the fulfilment of duty, unhampered by domestic trials. And I know no man who so thoroughly fulfils his duty as my Gabriel does, excepting his dear father, who, if he had lived, would by now have obtained his colonelcy, given the ordinary flow of promotion, which is always quicker in time of war. He is very like him. I see it more and more, being now so much the same age, though slightly thinner, and of course the difference in dress between a soldier and a clergyman, as I've said before." At that moment the subject of the ladies' conversation entered the room, and the discussion as to his physical condition had perforce to be dropped. Gabriel stayed on at his mother's, living out of doors as much as possible in the bracing Midland air, but he did not gain strength as quickly as he had hoped and expected. Mrs. Carr naturally did not notice this, but no symptom of his weakness and weariness was lost upon Janet. Her eagle eye penetrated the depression that he fain would hide, and she was not far from guessing the cause of that depression, although she had no idea of the name of the woman who had caused it. "I cannot think what has come to me," said Gabriel to her one day as they were walking in the fields together. "I can," was the prompt reply. "You have been doing too much for years, and now the bill has come in, and you have nothing to pay it with." "But I have been doing God's work, not my own," pleaded Gabriel. "That has nothing to do with it. If you spend more strength than you have got, the fact that you have spent it on God's work won't keep you from breaking down. Just as if you spend more money than you have got, the fact that you have spent it on charity won't prevent you from becoming bankrupt." Gabriel sighed. Janet was as hard upon him as he had been upon Mrs. Paul Seaton, only in Janet's case he called it harsh dealing, and in his own plain speaking. The pronoun which we place before a verb makes all the difference to the verb we use. For instance, "I speak the truth, you are unwarrantably severe," and "he makes himself detestably disagreeable," are really in essence the same verb adapted to fit the various pronouns. "You've got to use common sense even in religion," Janet went on, as if she were stating a paradox. "Well, haven't I used common sense?" "Never." "You've never had an atom of it to use." Gabriel could not help laughing. It was an old joke between them that Janet had made a corner in the common sense of the little household. "But I have sometimes borrowed yours," he argued, "and used that." "Well, it doesn't seem to have done much for you." "Perhaps there wasn't enough of it. As you have just so wisely remarked, my dear Janet, I could not spend more of an article than I had got to spend, and in the same way I could not borrow from you more of an article than you had got to lend." Then Janet laughed too, for she possessed that most excellent of all gifts in woman, a perfect temper. Nothing ever put her out or even ruffled her, and so she was eminently fitted for that vocation for which it is commonly and erroneously supposed that all women are equally fitted by nature, the vocation of matrimony. The power to become a good wife is as much a gift as the power to become a good painter or a good writer or a good musician, and no woman has it who is not endowed, either by nature or by grace, with a good temper. There is no quality which so mars and spoils and destroys the happiness of married life as bad temper. True, it interferes with the peace of all domestic relations, and is not a comfort in any department of life; but it is worse in a married woman than in a single one, because a wife has far more power to make another person miserable than has a spinster, and there is no more successful way of doing this than by a frequent display of temper. Therefore let the woman who has a bad temper which she cannot or will not control make up her mind to select the cloister rather than the hearth as her sphere of usefulness, giving the word cloister the broadest and most modern interpretation possible, inclusive of the college, the club, the art school, the hospital, the parish, and the political platform, for she is no more fit to be a wife than she is fit to be a steam engine, and she might as well attempt to draw a railway train as to make a man happy. It is not in her to do either. Janet Field's amiability was established beyond doubt or demur, so much so that every man who did not marry her, given the possibility of doing so, made more or less of a mistake. She had also another most valuable asset in married life, a sense of humour, though, as is the case with all of us, not as strong a sense as she herself believed it to be. There are two things which every man or woman that ever was born believes about himself or herself, namely, that he or she has a strong sense of humour, and is a small eater. Most people are convinced that they are poor sleepers as well, but this is not quite so universal an article of belief as the other two. "I can't see the sense," Janet persisted, "of doing twice as much as you can to day in order that you won't be able to do a quarter as much as you can to morrow. It seems to me poor economy." "I believe in putting one's whole strength into everything that one does, and doing it with all one's might," replied Gabriel. "That is just what you would believe in. It is exactly what I should have expected of you." And Janet shook her head as if she were reproving him for a fault. Gabriel was amused, but not penitent. "Then what do you believe in, may I be permitted to ask?" "In regulating one's expenditure by one's income, and not by one's enthusiasms, and in not putting more strength into a thing than a thing actually needs." "Oh, wise young judge, how I do honour thee!" murmured Gabriel in mock admiration. But in spite of his gibes, Janet calmly had her say. She was by no means a great talker, but if she meant to say a thing, she said it, and it was generally to the point. "Have you ever tried to open a door which you thought was hard to open, and which was really easy, and nearly tumbled backwards in consequence?" "Often and often." "That is just what you do with everything, Gabriel. You put your whole heart and strength into the doing of something that anybody else would do with very little effort at all, and then you fall backwards and hurt yourself, and some day you'll fall backwards so hard and hurt yourself so badly that you'll never get up again." "Then what do you want me to do to prevent this catastrophe?" Gabriel still spoke mockingly, but his mockery was kind. "Take things more easily, and consider yourself a bit. Oh, Gabriel," and here the hazel eyes were raised pleadingly, "do take care of yourself. You see you matter so dreadfully, and it would be so terrible if you got ill or anything." The expression in the hazel eyes was enough to touch any man, even a man who had never regarded them as anything but sisterly eyes, and it touched Gabriel a good deal. "You see, dear," he said, "I have my flock to consider as well as myself. You mustn't forget them." "But I do forget them. I forget them utterly. I don't care what becomes of them compared with you." Though Janet's diction might be involved, her meaning was clear. "I would sacrifice the whole of St. Etheldreda's parish to save you a pain in your little finger, Gabriel. I would indeed. What do the souls of 1,000 costermongers matter in comparison with your health? Nothing at all." "Oh, hush, Janet, hush! You mustn't talk like that. In the sight of God the soul of a costermonger is worth as much as mine. Besides," he added whimsically, "they are not costermongers. They are petty tradesmen of arrogant respectability, and so their souls are worth more than a costermonger's because they are so much rarer." But Janet was too much in earnest to smile. "I'm not looking at it from God's point of view. I'm looking at it from mine and Aunt Eveline's, and it breaks both our hearts to see you sacrificing your splendid, clever, handsome self for a lot of horrid, dirty, good-for-nothing shopkeepers." Gabriel shook his head. "Janet, Janet, haven't I told you that they are not dirty?" "I don't care. No amount of washing will ever make 1,000,000 of them equal to one of you, and nothing could ever convince me that it will." Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby by Ellen Thornycroft Fowler. Chapter 12. Fabia's Marriage. While Gabriel Carr was endeavouring for the sake of his health to let the grass grow under his feet in Marshire, Mrs. Paul Seaton was doing nothing of the kind in London. She had made up her mind to give Fabia Vipart in marriage to Charles Gaythorne, and she allowed herself no rest until this mission was safely accomplished. Over the trousseau she was simply indefatigable. She loved clothes, other women's as well as her own. Even in Isabel's smallnesses there was nothing really small, and she and Fabia were drawn nearer to each other over this said trousseau than they had ever been before. There is a wonderful freemasonry among all the women who love clothes, which the uninitiated cannot in the least understand or enter into. Fabia had grown much more amiable since her engagement. Success had a beneficial effect upon her, as it has upon so many people, and now that she was about to make what the world calls an excellent match, she received unstintingly that praise of men which is only accorded to those who do well unto themselves. True, her relations with Charlie Gaythorne were by no means ideal in their nature. She regarded him with mingled feelings of contempt and gratitude: gratitude for what he had, and contempt for what he was: and there was no modicum of love in the composition. As for him, he was more infatuated with her than ever, and the blindness of his adoration and the slavishness of his worship were just the things most calculated to strengthen Fabia's present attitude towards him. Had he shown himself in his dealings with her the man that he really was, it would have been better for her and better for him: but he did not, and so, like the rest of us, he had to bear the consequences of his own want of wisdom. There is nothing so severely punished in this world as a blunder. A crime is oftentimes forgiven, still oftener undiscovered: but a blunder has to meet its liabilities even to the uttermost farthing, and this is usually done in the full light of day before an audience that neither spares nor pities. Naturally, Fabia had not forgotten her encounter with the vicar of St. Etheldreda's, but her feelings for him also were mixed. She was to a certain extent angry with him for his treatment of her, but she was nothing like as angry as Isabel would have been in similar circumstances. With all her faults, and doubtless she had many, Fabia was no egotist. She was able to regard a thing or a person apart from that thing or that person's relation to herself, and she could not therefore fail to admire Gabriel's uprightness and singleness of heart, even though these had combined to her own undoing. Moreover, she had loved him from the moment that she discovered that he was stronger than she. His very sternness, which would have repelled a typically Western woman, was irresistibly attractive to the Oriental strain in Fabia's nature. She was born of a race of women who were accustomed to obey, and the more masterful a man was, the readier was she to fall down and worship him, and therefore nothing could have been more inimical to their future happiness than the humble and deferential attitude which Captain Gaythorne adopted towards his bride-elect. "What is going to happen to Mrs. Gaythorne?" Paul asked of his wife in one of the few moments which she spared to him out of the whirl of nuptial preparations. "Happen to her? What on earth do you mean? Nothing is going to happen to her that I know of. She isn't going to be married." "Heaven forbid! But isn't she going to turn out to make room for Fabia?" "Mrs. Gaythorne turn out to make room for anybody? Oh, Paul, what an idea! You'll be asking next whether the sun isn't going to turn out to make room for some acetylene gas company or other, or whether London isn't going to turn out to make room for the Garden City." Paul smiled, but he held his ground. "I thought mothers-in-law always turned out when their sons married — went to a dower house or something of that kind, don't you know?" But Isabel met him with open scorn. "Dower house, indeed! Think of Mrs. Gaythorne in a dower house! I don't believe the dower house is built that would contain Mrs. Gaythorne." "Mrs. Gaythorne is an excellent woman," began Paul, but his wife interrupted him. "I know what you are going to say, that her only failing is infallibility, and I agree with you: but it is a common fault. Wrexham has it badly, and so have others. I often wonder what people like Wrexham and Mrs. Gaythorne do to pass the time while the rest of the congregation are repeating the general confession. You are a bit inclined that way yourself." "Oh, Isabel!" Paul looked really hurt. His wife patted his shoulder encouragingly. "It is only a tendency in your case, not a really vicious virtue at present: but if you don't take care to make not less than one trifling mistake a week, and to be wrong on some unimportant matter at least every other day, you'll most assuredly be infallible by the time you are 50. But you can't locate infallibility in a dower house at any price. Its natural habitations are Vaticans and places of that kind." "Well, all I can say is then that I pity poor Fabia." Mrs. Seaton shook her head. "I don't. She won't mind. She likes Mrs. Gaythorne better than she likes me." "Oh, I say, that's impossible. You are talking nonsense, my darling. Nobody could like Mrs. Gaythorne better than they like you — not even old Gaythorne himself, if he were alive." "Possibly not. Mr. Gaythorne was a man, but heaps of women would, Fabia included." "Well, with one notable exception, I haven't a very high opinion of female intellect, as you know: but I must say I don't think so badly of the sex as all that." And Paul touched the tip of his wife's ear caressingly. He wanted to stroke her hair, but experience had taught him that when a woman's hair is what she calls done, he is a brave man who, even in the way of kindness, lays his hand upon it. "You never do Mrs. Gaythorne justice, Paul." "By Jove, I do, though! I think she is the most overbearing and dominating woman that Providence ever made, bar none." Isabel sighed reproachfully. "That comes of being a Radical. You Radicals don't really appreciate our old national institutions, such as the divine right of kings, and the established church, and the penny postage, and Mrs. Gaythorne. These things are part of the empire." "Are they?" Paul laughed and kissed his wife. "Then do respectable old Whigs such as yourself appreciate them?" "We do. For my own part, I feel towards Mrs. Gaythorne exactly as I feel towards the British Constitution and the Union Jack and the House of Hanover. They rouse noble and patriotic feelings in me. They make me proud of my country. They induce me to thank the goodness and the grace, and heaps of things like that. Roast beef on Sunday has exactly the same effect, and so have Handel's music and some of Macaulay's essays." Isabel was quite right. Mrs. Gaythorne had not the slightest intention of turning out to make room for anybody: nor would Charlie ever have imagined such a thing possible in his wildest dreams. And to tell the truth, Fabia did not altogether object to the present arrangement. She did not care enough for her future husband, for the prospect of a solitude à deux, to offer any attractions to her, and she entertained a very strong and real regard for Mrs. Gaythorne. The very masterfulness of the elder woman fascinated her, and held her captive, since strength of any kind appealed to Fabia. As has been remarked before, Miss Vipart doubtless had her faults, but she was of a stuff which is not bad raw material for the fashioning of daughters-in-law, good daughters-in-law not being in any way synonymous with good daughters or good wives. Much is written and said about mothers-in-law, little or nothing about daughters-in-law, yet the one class is as important as the other, and has equally its distinguishing characteristics. Roughly speaking, the better a woman is as a daughter or a wife, the less satisfactory she will prove as a daughter-in-law, and this in the very nature of things. For the more devoted she is to her husband, the more will she resent and be jealous of any influence which in any way whatever comes between her and him: and the more devoted she is to her own people, the less will she be in sympathy with the customs and traditions of another family. It is all a part of the great law of compensation. No woman can be a success in every relation of life. No woman can be a failure in all. Therefore, when all her little world condemns tiresome old Mrs. Jones, because she does not properly appreciate that charming young Mrs. Jones, who was so excellent a daughter in the days when she was Miss Smith, let it remember that the very characteristics which make Mrs. Jones junior a helpmeet for young Jones and a polished corner in the temple of the house of Smith, are the very characteristics which are most aggravating and irritating to young Jones's mother; and that probably in this matter the disagreeable old lady has far more to try her than the amiable young one, and should be judged accordingly, since we can none of us escape the defects of our qualities. So it came to pass that when the season was drawing to a close, when women recklessly put on their best clothes and their finest conversation for dinner parties, and did not take the trouble to go to non-RSVP parties at all; when bills which would have travelled through Parliament at the rate of the South Eastern earlier in the session, now rushed through it with the speed of falling stars; when the streets smelled of wood pavement and cabbage stalks, and there was neither excitement nor oxygen in the air, then did Charles Gaythorne take to wife Fabia Vipart, with much show and ceremony and ringing of bells, and give her the right, for the first time in her life, to meet her equals with equality, and to be of, as well as in, the fashionable world. In short, he admitted her within the precincts, and endowed her with the freedom of the red cord, for the which she was accordingly thankful. End of chapter 12.